This lecture is on romantic opera. We've already experienced romantic opera when we actually studied the Bar Skudinov by Mussorgsky, one of the composers of the Russian Five. And if you remember the big coronation scene, we have this spectacular staging and you have a chorus of people. That's very much the characteristics that we're going to experience with grand opera style during the Romantic period. It becomes a very important genre of opera. We have other examples of grand opera. We're not going to actually be seeing the Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, which is basically a religious war on stage, but we will be discussing William Tell, which is in a grand opera style by Rossini, and Aida, who is by Giuseppe Verdi. When we're talking about these grand opera styles, we're going to start with Rossini with the William Tell opera. I'm not asking you to actually watch the opera, but you're more than welcome to do so. It is an opera in 4 acts. It has a French libretto with the 2 librettists, Jourier and Bis. And Rossini wrote it in 1829. When we're dealing with Rossini as a composer, you're going to notice that Rossini's dates are 1792 to 1868. So this, what's interesting about this opera is that if you look at the dates, 1829, this is not so far into his life, but we know that he retired because he had made so much money at the age of 37 with the amount of money of $1 to $5 million throughout his lifetime. So therefore he was very well endowed with money, and therefore he decides he's not going to compose anymore. What's interesting about the William Tell that you're going to experience is that the overture, because we've spoken about overtures before this, the overture is divided into 4 parts, and it's very programmatic. You have the Scenic Alps, you have the Alpine Storm, you have the Shepherd's Call and the Call of the Revolution, which most people will identify as the Lone Ranger theme, later on actually used for that. When we talk about William Tell was a very famous Swiss hero. He was a hero and actually the action of this opera takes place in Switzerland in the 1300s, and the storyline is that William Tell and his son are incarcerated by the very evil Governor Gessler. And what happens is that William Tell, being a patriot, he goes against the governor, and the governor is going to teach him a lesson. So he actually makes him shoot an apple off of his son's head. When William Tell is successful, what happens is that Gessler, the governor, notices that there were 2 arrows that William Tell had, and he says to him, well, what about the second arrow? And of course William Tell's famous line is, that was the arrow for you if I had hurt my son. So at that point, William Tell is once again incarcerated, and at the very end he is freed by the revolutionaries, and at the end he actually kills the governor. So the storyline, like I said, is a storyline that kind of makes it very possible to see this in a grand style opera, meaning that there's a lot of factions on stage, revolutionaries, and what have you. So if you want to watch the opera, just know that it is in grand style. But the one part that you're responsible for will be the overture, and that is in 4 parts. Very interesting that he actually segues from one part to the other. William Tell, being an opera in 1829, it's very interesting that Rossini actually stops composing at the age of 37, because he's actually made from his operas, and he's created a lot of them, $1 to $5 million by that time. So therefore he just retires at the age of 37. The other opera by Rossini that I wanted to make mention of was the opera buffa. Now this is a totally different type of opera. It's comical. We've seen a comical opera before this when we actually experienced Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. It is in Italian. It's based on the same storyline as Marriage of Figaro, but it is a certain different part of the story. This is when Figaro is the barber. It was created by Rossini in 1816. It's in 2 acts. It has an Italian libretto by Sterbini, and it is after the Beaumarchais comedy, which of course we had studied before, and it takes place in Seville in the 1600s. The interesting thing about the Barber of Seville is that initially it wasn't even called that by Rossini. It was called Alma Viva, the Useless Precaution. The reason why it didn't actually take the name of Barber of Seville is because Paisiello, another composer in 1782, had already created a Barber of Seville, and he was very popular, and they were very worried that Rossini would get some flack for using the same themes of the barber Figaro as the barber. So he decides to go with a different name initially. Now today it's known as the Barber of Seville. And when it was first performed, there was a claque of Paisiello's fans that actually made a lot of noise during the first performance because they were really against Rossini deciding to use the same theme when Paisiello was a very, very famous composer. How dare he? When you are listening to the very famous Largo a Factotum, which is basically Room for a Jack of All Trades, it is the Figaro aria, the very famous Figaro aria. You're going to notice certain characteristics of this aria. First of all, Figaro is going to tell you all the things that he does as a barber. And a lot of times he uses a lot of very clever lines that are delivered with mixed in with nonsense syllables. And it's very quick, and they're called patter arias. This is a great example of that. The other thing that Rossini brings out is the bel canto style, which means beautiful song, characterized by lyrical lines, effortless technique, and a florid delivery. So you're going to hear a lot of ornamentation with this as well. So I think that you will really enjoy this aria. And of course, it is the very famous aria that has the Figaro, Figaro, Figaro. A lot of people think that's from Marriage of Figaro by Mozart, but no, it's from Barber of Seville by Rossini. Now, Rossini wrote a lot of operas, but you got to remember something that I just wanted to just kind of like tack on just for you to think about is that when he would go to one town, he would create an opera, and then they would go to the next town. So he would actually jump from one place to the other. So because he was jumping from one place to the other, and people didn't really know what he did somewhere else, a lot of times his operas had music from other operas that he had written. So he kind of reused a lot of his material, which is really very interesting. So they are the 2 operas, the Overture of William Tell that I want you to actually listen to, and the very famous Barber of Seville aria, the Figaro aria. Now we come to opera comique. Opera comique is different than the opera bouffe. Basically, it's French opera. It's not necessarily funny. The only reason why it had that tag was basically because it had spoken dialogue. And the one naturalist opera, which is a very realistic opera, is George Bizet's Carmen. This is very interesting because Carmen definitely is not a funny opera. It does have spoken dialogue. So what we notice is that in Carmen, in Bizet's Carmen, which is in 4 acts, 1875 was when actually that Bizet actually composed it, and it was the year of his death. He actually died suddenly after the 33rd performance. His libretto is by Melick and Olivet, and it's based on the novel by Prosper Mérimée. So it is in French, and the storyline is that Don José is a soldier, and Carmen actually does something in the cigarette factory, and she is actually incarcerated. Don José falls in love with her and helps her to escape, so now he's also on the run as well. And what do you think happens is that Carmen decides that she might have some love for Don José, but when he goes back home because his mother is dying, she falls in love with the Toreador, Escamillo. And so what happens is Don Jose comes back and he begs her to come back to her, and she just says, "Forget it," throws his ring at him, and says she's not returning to him. And that very final scene, he kills her. This takes place in Seville in 1820s. What I'm asking you to listen to is Carmen's aria, which is the habanera. We're very interesting because usually arias take the identification of the very first words that you hear. In this case, it's the rhythm, the Spanish rhythm that you hear as she talks about the fickleness of love. It's strophic, so it's actually by stanza. And it just has a very interesting dance rhythm of the habanera, and that's the reason why it's identified as such. The other part that I would like you to see is the final scene when Don Jose is so upset that Carmen won't return to him that he kills her. The interesting thing about that very last, the final scene is that you're going to hear a very interesting tune that's known as the Aspine. It's an old tune associated with the devil. Supposedly, when the devil was thrown out of heaven, it was the tune that went with him, and it's actually a kind of signifies death. And you'll hear it at the very end used as Carmen is being murdered. And then it's dee da 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 dum. And you'll hear that at the very end, and it's very interesting that that's used very symbolically. The other thing you have to remember is that Carmen is a gypsy girl, so therefore, in the middle of the opera, she draws the cards, the tarot cards that we talked about. Remember when we talked about Magic Flute? But the tarot card she draws, of course, is the card of death. And so there's almost like this premonition that she will die. So for Carmen, I would like you to listen to the habanera, which is Carmen's aria, as well as the very final scene, which is on YouTube. What's interesting about Carmen is that it inspired the Carmen Jones 1943 Broadway musical and the 1954 musical film, which was based on Hammerstein writing the book and the lyrics with Bizet's original music. In this case, the Carmen Jones of 1943, Carmen Jones is a parachute maker, and Joe is an Air Force man, and Husky Miller is a boxer, instead of the characters that we have in the original Carmen, and takes place in World War II. All right, and that brings us to Giacomo Puccini. Okay, his dates are 1858 to 1924. He went to the Milan Conservatory, and his very famous La Boheme and Madame Butterfly. The La Boheme, what's interesting is that the romantic theme of the starving artist is portrayed here when they're all in their attic, all of the artists trying to just keep aboard, whether they're poets or painters or what have you. But what's really interesting, I want you to know, that Puccini, at his death, was worth $200 million. He loved fast cars, women, and money. When you're listening to his works, I would say characteristically, so differently than the other works, is you have the soaring melodies accompanied by a huge orchestra. The La Boheme, the one part that I do want you to listen to is the very famous Rodolfo aria. And this is the storyline in Italian by Olica and Giacosa. He wrote it in 1896. It's in 4 acts, and it's actually considered a verismo opera, whereas the Carmen was considered a naturalist opera. But they were both kind of identifying with this sense of realism, meaning something that people could relate to in their lives. The storyline is Rodolfo is a poet. He meets Mimi, who is a maker of artificial flowers, when she knocks on his attic door because she's lost her candle, and then she misplaces her key. Rodolfo is the poet, he's a starving artist, tells her about himself, and the very famous aria, Che gelida manina, your hand is frozen. They fall in love. Unfortunately, Mimi is dying of TB. They separate after a jealous bout, and at the very end of the opera, Mimi does return to Rodolfo as she is dying, and friends sell things to pay for her medicine, but it's in vain as she dies in his arms. So it's a very romantic opera, meaning that You have everything from her being sick to the fact that Rodolfo falls in love with her, love at first sight, and then finally at the very end dies in his arms. So the part that I do want you to listen to of the Bohème is the very famous Rodolfo aria when he actually is introducing himself to her after her light has gone out and her key has been missing. What's interesting about the La Bohème is that the inspiration for Rent in 1996 was the La Bohème, the Jonathan Larson musical, where Roger and Mimi are faced with AIDS. What's interesting is if you know the Rent, there is a song called Light My Candle, which is a direct reference to La Bohème. That brings us to Puccini's second opera that I would like you to look at, and that's Madame Butterfly. It is, again, an opera of what we call verismo, everyday people in familiar situations. The Italian libretto is written by the same duo as the La Bohème, Illica Giacosa in 1904. The storyline is that Cha-Cha-san, who is Butterfly, is a geisha girl. Lieutenant Pinkerton, who's in the Navy, has a contract with Cha-Cha-san and supposedly marries her. But what happens is that he marries her and she takes it very, very seriously to the point where she is going to have his child. He does not know this because he has now gone back to America. And what does he do in America? He goes and he marries an American wife. So he comes back to Japan, and what happens is she doesn't realize he's married someone else. She's been waiting for him. And the other thing that we notice is that he doesn't realize he has a son. So when the two of them realize the situation, the only honorable thing for Cha-Cha-san to do to give her son a better life is to commit harikari, which is in the last scene. This takes place in Nagasaki, Japan, early 1900s. As you can guess, the first performance was very controversial. I want you to listen to the Un Bel Di, which is the One Fine Day He Will Come Back, and that is the very famous aria of Cha-Cha-san. And with it, you're going to notice these soaring melodies with this huge orchestra in the background. And then at the very end, the final scene, I want you to actually see the scene where she commits harikari. And then you hear Pinkerton in the coming down as he doesn't even realize that she has done this and just calling out her name. You always think if maybe it was just a little earlier, she would not have killed herself. And I want you to listen to how the orchestra creates the drama around this death scene. The inspiration for Miss Saigon was, of course, Madame Butterfly. It was created in 1989, the very famous musical by Claude Michel Schoenberg and as composer and Cameron McIntosh as the producer. Miss Saigon takes place in Vietnam and Thailand, and the backdrop is the Vietnam War of 1975 to 78. So I did want you to know there was a connection. The final composer of the set of romantic opera composers is Giuseppe Verdi, 1813 to 1901. He applied to the Milan's Conservatory, but it was rejected due to his age. He was 19, but he studied privately because he had a wonderful patron. His name was Antonio Barezzi, who was a merchant, and he was a patron of Verdi's education, as well as the father of, it became Verdi's father-in-law when his daughter married Verdi. When we deal with Verdi's works, we notice that there's a lot of human drama in it. He was also one of the first to remove the division between the aria and the recitative. A couple things about Verdi's life. I just wanted you to know he was identified with the Risorgimento, a movement that aimed to liberate Italy from foreign rule and reunite its various regions. There was a call via Verdi the Patriotic Call, which actually translated each one of those letters into Victor Emmanuel Re d'Italia. The other thing I want you to know about Giuseppe Verdi and some of his works, it's not necessarily the work that we're going to look at Aida, but he used what we call reminiscent motifs. They were distinctive themes of motifs that introduced earlier in the opera. So therefore you have the kiss theme in the Otello, if you remember when, in the kiss theme in the Otello we have when at the very beginning Otello kisses Desdemona, that's the kiss of love, but at the end it's going to be the kiss of death when he kills her. So these reminiscent motifs are very prevalent in Verdi's works. The Aida is the one that I would like you to look at. The Italian libretto is created by Ghislanzoni. It was created in 1871 and produced in Cairo, Egypt, 4 acts. It is a grand style opera. You're going to see a lot of grand style in the very the worded triumphal march. It is considered an opera seria because at the very end there is death. The storyline is that we have Aida, who is an Ethiopian princess that ends up being the handmaiden to Amneris, the daughter of the king of Egypt, because she's like a part of the spoils and Amneris becomes her employer. Radames is the captain of the guard. Amneris is in love with Radames, but guess what? Aida and Radames are in love with each other, and this is a problem. What happens is also Amonastro, the king of Ethiopia, is also taken as a prisoner, but no one knows who he really is. And he knows that Aida is in love with Radames, and Radames is in love with Aida, and he asks Aida to find out where the next, what's going to happen next through Radames, which is a very difficult decision for Aida, because now should she find out from Radames and make him actually a traitor, or is it because of the love of her father that she's going to do so? So at the very end, of course, Amneris kind of gets wind of Aida and Radames speaking about what's going to happen next. Amneris loves Radames so much that she even tells him, like, if you marry me, I'll kind of forgive you, but Radames says he can't because he loves Aida. And the very famous tomb scene is at the end, where you have Amneris at the top, and at the bottom, of course, you have the death of Radames and Aida. The 2 scenes that I would like you to look at is the triumphal scene, which is when Radames is triumphal as the captain of the guard, and then the tomb scene, where the 2 of them, Aida and Radames, are going to die because they love each other as Amneris looks on. And the very last word is pace, meaning that it's almost like Amneris forgives them for their love. What's interesting about this work is it was very much the inspiration of Elton John's Aida, which was a plot that was definitely influenced by Verdi's work. So these are the operas that I would like you to have an opportunity to look at on YouTube, or actually listen to the various parts so that you can understand the difference between grand style opera, naturalist opera, verismo opera, and the various ways that opera develops during the Romantic period.